Hello, everyone. Welcome to the summer event. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join our session for today. We'll wait a couple more minutes just to let everybody in. But while you wait, please introduce yourself in the chat. Put your organization, where you're coming from, and then your name. So we'll wait a couple more minutes, but welcome. Nice to see some familiar faces. Hi, Tamara. Hi, Tarina. Hi, Lori. Hi, Elise. Hi, Chitali. Thanks for joining both events for today. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Ambry. Nice to see you. Hi, Elise. Happy Monday to you too. Good to see you, Tarina. Hi, Tracy. Nice to see you again. All right, we'll give it maybe a minute more, and then we can start. But it's lovely to see some faces from last Thursday. So we had the LIP summary event last Thursday. So it's lovely to see some faces who are attending both events. So yeah. Perfect. All right, so we'll start. Welcome again. It's just lovely to have everybody here. Please continue to introduce yourself, but I will introduce myself. My name is Marie Page. I'm the project lead for Cohorts of Engagement. I'm also joined by my colleague, Megan Reelsmith, who will be helping drop links in the chat. So before we go any further, join me in acknowledging the land which we are on. I am privileged to live and work in Hamilton, Ontario. I acknowledge the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. Treaty 3 was a treaty signed in 1792 between the principal chiefs of the Mississauga Nation and John Gray Simcoe. The treaty covers the territory between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So this is what you can expect for in the next hour. I'll go through housekeeping items, an overview of the cohort events that we've had up to date and how today's event fits into the past 3 months. Then we will go into the main portion of our program, which is the expert presentation on our chosen theme. And then after the presentation, we will have that 10-minute Q&A period, opening up the floor to any questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And then finally, we'll wrap up the cohort of engagement event. So let's get into the housekeeping. So the expert presentation will be recorded, but the Q&A will not be. We do want to promote those open discussions. Please ensure your Zoom display reflects your first and last name. This is helpful for us and the presenter when we get to that Q&A segment. Please feel free to engage in the chat. So not everyone is able to share it at the same time. This is a really good way to participate and connect with what is being said. We do invite you to keep your video on if possible, so we can interact and really connect with each other. If there are any resources or tools that are provided, we will be putting them in the spreadsheet created for the cohorts. I will also be sending a follow-up email after the event with the presentation slides. So let me cap our journey one more time so that you can see the progress and really where we are now. So all the way back in April, we had the kickoff event to brainstorm priority areas within the sector that posed challenges, creating a roadmap of our discussion points. You know, we were able to get the perspectives from organizations across Canada because this is really a pan-Canadian cohort. Our Muddy Points activity took place in May to determine which subject area from the many topics we had brainstormed a month earlier we wanted to focus on. So the activity allowed us to hone on root causes, paying really special attention to some of those systemic issues and then issues with solutions. We were able to settle through a vote on one priority theme. So the theme chosen for the literacy basic skills and adult education organizations cohort was funding and sustainability. We switched things up for June for our Energizer event. This was really to focus on collaboration and how we can work together to achieve organizational and sectoral goals with those interested really in the same outcomes. Both cohorts connected together, which was really beneficial. So we are now at the summary event, the last event, where we get to learn from an expert on the theme that really seems to be a challenge across organizations and across our pan-Canadian literacy basic skills and adult education sector. So I really do hope that you come away with at least one insight after today's presentation and event. So I would now like to introduce our speaker, Emily Jensen. Emily is the manager of Strategic Advocacy with Imagine Canada. Her work currently focuses on advancing funding reform, advocating for more and better data about the non-for-profit sector from the federal government, and running a federal weekly politics letter. So she has worked both in the governmental and non-for-profit sector. I think I can speak for most of us in saying funding and sustainability is a theme that takes up a lot of time and energy to maintain and get. This sector definitely knows the struggles that come with working in an environment that is almost entirely reliant on funding. We are really excited to have you here chatting about this theme. So please join me in welcoming Emily Jensen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Can everybody hear me all right? Marie? I'll just assume that you can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so hi, I'm Emily. I have been with Imagine Canada for about 4 years. I hope some of you have heard of Imagine Canada, but if you haven't, we're a national charity and our mission is other charities and nonprofits. So basically, our goal is to create and foster a really strong charitable and nonprofit sector so that we can, have a great, thriving quality of life in Canada, strong communities, all of that kind of stuff. So we do that through a few different things. You may have interacted with Imagine Canada through our Grant Connect platform, which is a paid subscription service where you can find funding opportunities, although there is a way to access it for free, which I'll talk about later. We also have a standards program that accredits organizations for good standards of financial management, governance, that kind of thing. But I'm on the public policy team, and we do advocacy related to policy issues that impact the sector at the federal level specifically. We also interact with others doing advocacy at more of the local, provincial, territorial level, but our focus is really the federal government. I am located in Montreal, and a special shout out. I saw someone from PEI in the chat. I'm from PEI originally. It's rare to find another islander. So hi, Lori. Anyways, so with that, I think I will just dive into my presentation so we can go to the next slide. So basically, I have been working on this issue. Hi, Lori, in the chat. I have been working on this issue for about 2 years. Imagine Canada has long looked at funding issues of different sorts. As you can well imagine, it's one of the most common issues that impact charities and nonprofits. But specifically, I've been looking at how the federal government acts as a funder over the last couple of years. We've also, you may have heard, like last year, we were doing work related to how unincorporated, basically non-charities can access funding. So we do lots of different work in this general area. But over the past 2 years, been doing policy development, so research, stakeholder interviews, writing policy briefs, trying to come up with policy recommendations related to how the issues with how the government acts as a funder, the federal government, as well as solutions to that. And I know that you've all identified funding as an issue. And so that means that you know the issues, basically. I'm sure you've all encountered them in your daily life, in your work, as impediments to, achieving your missions. So I won't go too deep on this, because I think you probably know better than I these issues. But a general overview is that there often isn't enough core or unrestricted funding, or any core or unrestricted funding available to the nonprofit sector that would just generally support the mission of the organization. That can be really hard to come by. And then when we go to project-based funding, which is, the most common form of grant funding, a lot of the time it does not cover fully the administrative costs associated with the project that is being funded. And so that means a lot of things like IT, HR, infrastructure, rent, these costs are really underfunded, and that has lots of implications. There are also a lot of issues with timelines in general. So one is just that often funding is super short term. It can be like a year. And also often the government will get the funding to folks late, but without extending the amount of time that they have to spend it to use the money. So a 1-year funding term is already quite short, but then it can turn into, a 9-month funding term if the government is late getting the money out. Similarly, a lot of funding is short, but when it can be renewed, there are often big gaps in between the terms of the funding, and organizations can't really spend in the meantime. And so often I've heard from people who've had to, say, lay off staff in between, even though the project then picks up 2-3 months later, and they just have to, rehire, retrain new people, and it's really inefficient and, unfortunate. And then there's a huge administrative burden that's associated with the processes related to federal funding. And sorry, I should say, just because my research and my stakeholder interviews mainly focus on the federal government, but a lot of this is broadly applicable to other levels of government, as well as some philanthropic and corporate funders. So yeah, big administrative burden. Often reporting can be really excessive. Some federal grants require monthly reporting, which is, it's very hard to have done much new within 4 weeks. That requires a new report, and it creates a lot of work, especially in the context where the funding is not even covering the administrative costs associated with the project. So that's a quick overview. Could we go to the next slide, please? And now the more interesting or meaningful part is, what does this mean for communities, for organizations? So, the reason that we're all here is to serve communities, whether it's through arts programming, environmental programming, social services. When we cannot, when it is difficult to find core funding, it often means that organizations jump from basically one project-based funding, one short-term contract or grant to another. And that can really make it hard for organizations to, really invest in the quality of the programs and services that they're offering, or even to have core continuous programs that are offered over time. I've spoken to many, especially smaller organizations, who only have one program or service at a time, and it's whatever they got funded for. So maybe they'll do a program for 2 years, then that funding ends, so that program ends, and then they start a new service or program based on whatever funding was available that they could access. So, it's not something where over 10 years they've honed their skills and really been able to invest in one kind of program and serve a community long term. It's more, a rapid succession of trying new things, which, you know, can bring in innovation, but also lots of challenges and make it hard for those who come to rely on the services to then have to adjust when they end. Another thing that I'll note is, you know, there is a big impact, like a trickle down impact, I guess you could call it, on nonprofit workers, because when the organizations that we work for have short-term and underfunded, have short-term funding and they are underfunded, this really, this means that we have low wages, few benefits, and often precarious work. So short-term contract work is, you know, a really direct implication of the way that the sector is funded. And this is something that is really widespread in the sector. And I will note, it's not really, this is kind of on a different policy file I've worked on, but we now know that the nonprofit sector is 77% women, it's about 47% immigrants, and it's 35% racialized and Indigenous people. And so when we see these difficult working conditions and, you know, like a lack of decent work, it's really impacting that already kind of vulnerable workforce. And last, just that the actual resilience and like sustainability of nonprofits are put at risk when they cannot, you know, really invest in even computers from like the last decade, when they have frequent turnover, when they can't afford to, you know, hire a fundraiser that could help them reach a more sustainable place. So that can be a real challenge. And of course, when things like the COVID-19 pandemic hit, when crisis hits, that can just kind of magnify all of these issues and make it even harder for organizations to serve their communities at the times when their communities need them most. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Yes, so I wanted to share, I've talked a bit generally about the impacts, but through my work on this file, I've spoken to a bunch of different organizations about how it's impacted their communities, their workers very specifically. And so I wanted to share a few quotes from these organizations. So this quote is from an executive director of a Indigenous youth organization in Ontario. And this quote really speaks to the fact that they often have to really, it's very difficult to meaningfully engage your community on what their priorities are and then carry those out, because basically, if those priorities don't match with the priorities, the funders' priorities, then you kind of just have to, you have to fit yourself into the funder's box in order to get funding and survive to keep moving. So that is, you know, it makes it difficult to be really accountable to the people who you are supposed to be prioritizing. Next slide, please. And this is a quote from the executive director of a small community center for the 2S LGBTQ community in Newfoundland. And this quote really speaks to the fact that, you know, I spoke about like low wages, precarious work. I would say that burnout, mental health concerns are an issue when you do have working conditions where people work long hours for little pay, and often in difficult work, you know, like emotionally exhausting work. So that's definitely a concern when it comes to funding issues. Next slide, please. And this is my last impact quote, and it is from the someone at an environmental organization in Nova Scotia. And it really just speaks to the fact that, you know, the nonprofit sector is tackling some of the biggest environmental and social issues of our day. They're incredibly complex. And it's just natural that we therefore need resources and tools in order to do this work well. And there's going to be, you know, a cost if we're not able to access those resources. Next slide, please. So after going through all the kind of depressing talk about what is wrong, I wanted to share some more positive aspects of this issue. So there are signs of progress. So one that is really exciting is what is called the G's and C's transformation process, which is a very like government speak way of saying that Global Affairs Canada is trying to transform how they fund nonprofits and charities. G's and C's stands for grants and contributions, which is just the two kinds of funding agreements that the federal government uses. So they, at Global Affairs Canada, which of course handles all of the funding for like international development, humanitarian organizations, that kind of stuff, they have a big team that is taking on a 5-year program or project to transform everything about the way that they fund nonprofits and charities in the international space. So that includes the technology they use, the policies, the culture, the training that's given to funding officers. It's like a very ambitious project with incredibly ambitious goals. You can Google it or email me afterwards if you want to learn more. There's some stuff online about it. But I would say it's obviously very niche right now. It's just for the international development kind of subsector, but it's exciting because if it works, which of course is not guaranteed, but if it does, it could be a great model for other departments and ministries within the federal government or for other, levels of government, other funders. So definitely keeping an eye on that. In the philanthropy foundation world, we have seen over, I'd say the last decade, a shift towards a lot more interest in trust-based philanthropy. And so trust-based philanthropy is basically like a set of principles about how you can give, and it is, I guess, less focused on risk, more on impact, more on relationships, trust, and accountability to communities versus like accountability to funders. And it favors things like alternative reporting, I guess, options, like being able to give like vocal reports rather than always a written one, having to report in a less strenuous way, providing unrestricted funding, not asking people to fill out the same information and again, all of these kinds of things to just kind of lessen the burden on those being funded and allow them to really focus on serving their communities. So that's really positive. And on a kind of related note, during the pandemic, we saw a number of foundations kind of turn towards unrestricted funding. Folks who were not yet doing that, but saw that, there was a crisis, people needed help now, and nobody really knew what was going on. So there were a number of foundations who early on in 2020 said, we're just turning all of our grants into unrestricted funding. We're telling our grantees to just use the money in the way that they see fit and serve the community, because that's what needs to happen, and just let us know what you did with it later. And so that's interesting because it could be a precedent. It's like it pushed funders into an experience that maybe they weren't ready to take on otherwise, but maybe that they've hopefully learned from and will continue. And then the other one that I'll point out is that recently the federal government has created a few programs that are not unrestricted, but they do really focus on what they call capacity building. And so this is often things in terms of investing in computers or technology, software, governance, HR, maybe fundraising capacity, improving space like office space or community space. And these so far have been quite targeted. So they're like the LGBT Community Capacity Fund, the Supporting Black Community Initiative, and recent investments in disability organizations. Those are obviously a response to data showing that there are inequities in the funding environment and that some organizations have, or some parts of the sector have been underfunded historically. And then the Community Service Recovery Fund is more of a reaction generally to support the sector after what it went through during COVID. But it's a great, while they're very targeted, they're not general, core operating support or anything like that. They are really promising, basically acknowledgements of the need for capacity and core funding. So hopefully the government will kind of learn from that, see how successful that is, and keep building on those models going forward. And I'll move to the next slide, please. Yeah, and then so Marie asked me to talk about kind of what organizations can do. And I have some tips and tricks or just some general advice, things to think about for individual organizations on the next slide. But first, I wanted to say that this is really a collective issue. It's not something that just one or two organizations are facing. It's really a mindset and a systemic issue, especially when it comes to the federal government. So it needs, a collective response. And so I, especially selfishly as a public policy and advocacy person, believe the best way that we can tackle this problem is together. And so there are two, basic ways to do this. One is to yourself build coalitions, advocate for change. And so that can sound really like a big idea, maybe intimidating if you haven't done it before. But you can start really small. For instance, if you got together with a couple of organizations in your community and just reached out to, for instance, local municipal government, the local United Way or Community Foundation, to just start a conversation about their funding practices, community needs, and try to talk through how you can move forward in a better way. Like that's I think a really great place to start at the local level. And then of course there are existing advocacy efforts. So some of you may be linked into regional networks already. In pretty much everywhere across the country, there is a regional network. And if you don't know it, I'm happy to help you find that place. So some communities have it, like London, Ontario has Pillar Nonprofit Network. In PEI, there's a new PEI Community Sector Network or Council. So there's lots of initiatives already that exist, and a lot of them do advocacy work, and you can just tap into that rather than having to, start your own thing. You can just lend your support to existing efforts. Next page, please. And here is more individualized tips. I guess one thing that I would say is, well, first I'll say, these are all hard because you're in a system that incentivizes certain types of behavior, such as being the cheapest to offer or showing how cheaply you can offer a service. So I think a classic example of this is kind of like a food bank saying that they can feed a family for a day on $2 or something, kind of like that. These kind of fundraising appeals that try to really emphasize efficiency, but are not actually realistic, because even if the raw food itself maybe costs $2 because they have partnerships, agreements, stuff like that, the rent, the cost of staff, all of that is not really being factored into that. And it really gives a false perception, I think, of how cheaply things can be done. Not that all of those are false, but I don't know. Engaging in a race to who can do something, who can show that they're doing something the cheapest, is not necessarily going to help us make an argument for funding the costs that we really need to fund in order to do our work effectively, efficiently, to get to the root causes of issues. So yeah, generally just challenging the perceptions that these administrative and core costs are negative or that they're signs of inefficiency. I think a lot of the time being really specific about what these costs are can be one of the most effective things, because if you just hear, oh, charity's spending a lot of money on administrative costs, you think, okay, well, it should be on programs. But then if you hear that it's, for legally mandatory insurance, or that it's for computers so that organizations can actually, reach the communities they're trying to reach, or it's rent for the office space that they need to do their work, it becomes more clear, because people are used to businesses having those kinds of expenses, to public organizations having them. So why not nonprofits and charities? Why would we not need basic, infrastructure? Yeah, I guess the other two things are to try to find funders that are already interested in or already practicing trust-based philanthropy, or who have provided unrestricted funding in the past, because that can make your life a lot easier. And in the resource pages, which I think is going to be the next slide, I do have some research that looks at Canadian funders who've been doing that kind of work. So you can browse the list of people who were interviewed and see if any of them could be potential funders for you. And then the other thing I'll say is do everything in your power to offer decent work, good working conditions to nonprofit workers. So funding is often cited as a big barrier to offering, good working conditions. And there is legitimacy to that issue. We've just gone through how that all works. But I think it can also sometimes be used as like a scapegoat to not also look at what we could do. Yes, there are things that we can't do, but there are things that we could do, such as offering employees more flexible working conditions, allowing them to have like a better work-life balance, work around their care responsibilities, making sure that you just have good HR policies in place that keep people safe. And I have a resource for some free HR resources after that. But I guess just looking at like what is possible and is there something we can do this year to improve things for our workers, because obviously funding makes it hard to do, but it's not impossible to do anything for our workers. And I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, so here's just a couple resources. A lot of these are basically like explaining the issue, but I will point out two in particular that are more like concrete, useful resources. So the first is Grant Connect Community Edition. So as I mentioned, we have this paid service where you can get access to this database and find grants that suit your profile. So that is a paid service if you want an individual account. But we also have many libraries, municipalities, and sector resource centers, such as volunteer centers, have paid for what's called a community edition subscription. And that means that you can go to, say, a library and use that service for free in those spaces. So that can be a really interesting option. And HR Intervals is a new website where it is basically curated HR resources for the that's really dedicated to the nonprofit sector. And everything on there has been vetted by HR professionals as well as anti-racism, anti-oppression professionals. And it's available in English, French, totally free. So definitely encourage you to check that out. And I think that is it for my presentation. So I'll leave it there for now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for that presentation. I think you did a really, really wonderful job highlighting the funding issues we've discussed as a group, and really how this affects the job. But you've also given us some really good tips and resources. So thank you